Between the 18th and the 23rd of September 1942, the 41st Infantry Division of the United States Army were on the move from Rockhampton to Gladstone and Port Alma for embarkation north. On Sunday, 20 September 1942, all non-military trains out of Rockhampton were cancelled so that the lines and rolling stock could be made fully available for the transport of the division. Special troop trains did the load up specifically from the camps, which were scattered around Rockhampton. There was an absence of efficient road access to and from anywhere heading east through those movement days in late September 1942. The advance party of the 41st Infantry Division had arrived in June and July 1942, with the entire division being in camp in Rockhampton by the end of August 1942. The logistics of what was occurring was very impressive. The first establishment in Rockhampton was some 20,000 personnel of all ranks. There was an extension of camps in every direction out of the city, with the staff work being conducted in various buildings and with stores and offices housed in town. Within a year, from June and July 1942, there was the arrival of another second complete division in Rockhampton, the 24th Infantry Division, and a significant portion of another division, which included amphibious forces. There was, at the peak of movements, some 70,000 US personnel in central Queensland. On the 17th of September 1943, Eleanor Roosevelt visited Rockhampton to visit that very large presence of troops and wrote the following in her capacity as a representative of the American Red Cross and the American Friends of the Service Committee, additional to being the First Lady. And Eleanor Roosevelt both interestingly and relevantly stated, and I quote, "Have I told you about the houses in Rockhampton? They're built on stilts high off the ground. In many cases, people keep cars under their houses, and often the washing is done there and hung up to dry. Things are stored in the space below the house since it is cooler. Flowers and roses are planted as screens, and nowhere did I see an unattractive approach to a house. They are all detached with ground about them, and the people are good gardeners, for hedges of bougainvillea in every colour grow in profusion. In every camp we visit there are a number of dogs as pets, but in one camp the soldiers caught and tamed a possum. The commanding officer said it visited his tent frequently, but was not always welcome. So when we saw the possum, it was tied to a fence by a long string. They had built a gateway to their camp, and perched on top of the highest point was a koala bear. Far and away the most appealing pet was a 3-month-old wallaby sitting in a wire enclosure, with the soldier leaning down, feeding the wallaby milk from a bottle. In this country they seem to be wasteful of their trees. Everywhere in the wooded section you see them completely ringed about, so they will die. The reason given to me is that they must clear the land so that grass will grow better for grazing purposes. Of course, there are still vast areas of densely wooded sections, but as I looked down from the plain, I recognised the familiar look of eroded land which we now have to try and stop in our own country. Many letters have come to me on this trip, but I'm going to give you an extract from one because I think many mothers of youngsters at home will appreciate its appeal. I hope you will like Australia and have a happy visit here. Australia would have been a different place now if all the American soldiers had not come and saved our country for us. We cannot thank them enough. My daddy went with the AIF to Malaya to fight there, but he has been missing since Singapore fell. The little girl is only 13, but she reflects the feelings which make so many people here offer their homes to our boys in this faraway land. Eleanor Roosevelt. It was in this context, only 6 months or so after Pearl Harbor, that Major General Horace Hayes Fuller arrived with his 41st Infantry Division in central Queensland. Why is it that Fuller's name is not well known, at least amongst others, in Queensland? Who was he? Born at Fort Meade, South Dakota, the son of a US Army major, he was in the class of 1909 at West Point, an eminent class with Generals George Patton, Eichelberger, Devers, Lee, Harding, and Simpson. Initially a cavalry officer, he served in the 11th Cavalry in 1914 at Fort Oglethorpe, the 7th Cavalry at Fort William McKinley, the regiment that fought the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Lieutenant Colonel George Custer made his last stand, and Fuller then served in the Philippines until 1916. He transferred to the Field Artillery in 1916, returning to the United States to serve with the 17th Cavalry at Fort Bliss in Texas. He sailed for France in October 1918, joining the 108th Field Artillery, participating in the Battle of Sombray, earning promotion to temporary lieutenant colonel on 11 September 1918. And he then commanded the 109th Field Artillery until March 1919. After returning to the United States, he reverted to the permanent rank of captain from that temporary rank of 2 ranks higher, lieutenant colonel. Attending the Command and Staff College in 1922 and 1923, and staying on as an instructor until 1927 at the college, when he then left for the Army War College. He served in the War Department General Staff, being promoted substantively to Lieutenant Colonel on 1 May 1934. He was appointed as the US military attaché in Paris, where he remained until August 1940, watching the fall of France while in situ, and in this role as attaché, he developed a level of notoriety, at least in the military community, by predicting the efficiency of the German overrun of Europe. He had been promoted to full colonel in July 1938. On 1 October 1940, he was promoted to the temporary rank of brigadier in command of the 3rd Infantry Division Artillery, and finally he was appointed as Commandant of the Command and General Staff College in June 1941. But with the sudden death of Major General George White, he was appointed as commander of the 41st Infantry Division on 15 December 1941. It is worth recalling for just a moment the specific context of that period in Australia, which, as you know, was very challenging. Prime Minister Curtin had been elected on 7 October 1941, with the ministry being sworn in on the same day. On 19 November 1941, HMS Sydney II engaged the German raider HSK Cormoran in the afternoon, less than a day out of Perth. Of HMAS Sydney's total complement of 42 officers and 603 ratings, none survived. Then, of course, on the 7th, there was Pearl Harbor on the other side of the date line, and on the 8th, on this side of the date line, the landings in Hong Kong and Malaya. The fighting in Singapore lasted from 8 to 15 February 1942, with more than 130,000 Allied troops taken prisoner including the capture of some 15,000 Australian soldiers. And of these, more than 7,000 were to die as prisoners of war. It was in that context into which Major General Fuller came to Australia. The predominance of the 41st Infantry Division embarked from San Francisco on 19 March 1941 in a convoy that included RMS Queen Elizabeth. The convoy reached Australia on 6 April, and because Melbourne could not accommodate the Queen Elizabeth at that time, the troops unloaded in Sydney, with the troops and the cargo being moved to Melbourne by rail and by smaller Dutch shipping. As each contingent arrived of the division, it moved to a camp near Seymour in Victoria, with training being conducted at Puckapunyal. In July 1942, the division moved by rail to Rockhampton. The division had arrived in Australia with a reputation in the United States Army as the top-ranking National Guard division and one of the 3 top divisions in the whole Army, a reason for its early shipment. When Major General Fuller arrived in Rockhampton, he took up residence at Clancholla, the range residence then of the McDonald family. In an article written in the Rockhampton Bulletin in the 1950s about the Second World War years, it was said, and I quote, that when Rockhampton was labouring under such a rigorous blackout that one hesitated to light a cigarette in the street, one of the generals threw a party at his range residence at which electric light blazed both indoors and out halfway through the night. The residence, Clancholla, is at Ward Street and was, until 1939, at the right-angle turn for the trams as they headed up to the Botanic Gardens past the now Mater Hospital. This was the tram turn where, in 1913, 3 people were killed when a tram car capsized on the bend at the front of that house on the corner of Ward Street and Dagmar Street after the tram had departed the Rockhampton Botanic Gardens following an afternoon weekend performance. John Ferguson, a builder who had purchased a large share in the Mount Morgan mine and who had served on the council in Rockhampton, including as mayor and then in the Queensland Legislative Assembly, and subsequently in the Legislative Council, and briefly in the new Commonwealth of Australia Senate, had built Kenmore House, the modern-day Mater Hospital. Peter Fitzallan McDonald, the pastoralist, who had gone to the King's School in Sydney and who was, later, himself a member of the Queensland Legislative Assembly, had moved to central Queensland in 1857. Stuart McDonald, his son, purchased Kenmore House in 1906 after the death of John Ferguson. The McDonalds subdivided the land and built Clancholla, the house that Fuller was to occupy, their primary residence being at Highland Plains at Clermont, Queensland. Stuart McDonald brought thoroughbreds to a lower paddock at the house on Ward Street, Rockhampton, before sending the horses out to Highland Plains and other properties in the family group. When Major General Fuller arrived, it was only some 7 months after Pilot Officer John Campbell McDonald, the second son of Stuart McDonald, was killed in action in flying battle in the Middle East while serving with the 55th Squadron of the Royal Air Force on 19 October 1941. The other son, Ronald Somerville McDonald, was a Spitfire pilot who later in the war commanded No. 452 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, serving in the defence of Darwin and then heading north to Borneo. Major General Fuller's chemical officer was Colonel Harold Riegelman. The chemical officer having responsibility for the division's flamethrowers, smoke screens, etc. Harold Riegelman wrote a series of books during the war, which were effectively diaries of his time with the division. In his book Caves of Byack, an American officer's experiences in the Southwest Pacific, published in 1955, Chapter 3 is headed City of Sin, Sweat, and Sorrow. The chapter begins. In the early 1850s, tough, restless men chanced bush to find new grazing land north and west of the miserable frontier town of Brisbane. Among these pioneers were the Archer brothers, first settlers in central Queensland. And Riegelman goes on. Before the Yankee invasion in mid-1942, Rockhampton had sunk into an innocuous torpor. Its wide paved streets were quite empty. The young men were away to the war, cattle prices were down, business was slack, few automobiles were in use. Ancient buses had replaced trams and ground, puffed and scolded their way on fixed routes with passengers except for early morning and early evening travel. Rockhampton was like an 1890 American prairie town of comparable size. Its high tide had come and gone. It lived quietly and blushed nostalgically at its memories. It was respectable and bored. General MacArthur had arrived in Australia in 1942 in May. The 41st Infantry Division, raised in Washington and Oregon, which had originally been on its way to the doomed Philippines campaign, mainly bivouacked its 20,000 personnel to the north of town. When General Eichelberger, the Corps commander, arrived in October 1941, soon after the 41st Infantry Division left in September, he took up residence at the Grant House, also in Ward Street. The town hall was used as the Corps command. Harold Riegelman refers in his book in great detail to all his visits to Archer properties, travelling west remarkably regularly, travelling to Brisbane and to New Guinea, but always returning to Rockhampton. After they left Rockhampton in September 1941, Major General Fuller led the division in the attacks on Salamaua, Hollandia, and Byack. He was finally relieved of command by General Eichelberger, at his own request, in June 1944 during the Byack campaign. Major General Fuller was awarded the Army Distinguished Service Medal, and the citation stated, for service in the South East Pacific from 6 April 1942 to 17 June 1944. Commanding one of the first infantry divisions to arrive in theatre, he demonstrated exceptional ability and sound judgment in bringing his division to a high standard of efficiency in preparation for jungle combat. He successfully commanded the division in the defence of the Gona area and in operations against the enemy from Gona to Morobe, which elements of his division participated in the landing at Nassau Bay and the drive on Salamaua. Later, he led his division in the amphibious assaults against Hollandia and Byack Island. In all his attacks, he inflicted decisive defeat on an experienced enemy. His personal courage and inspiring leadership made possible the able expedition of assigned missions. Major General Fuller was a stubborn chain smoker. He had a reputation for efficiency and was well regarded by his officers in the division, and was apparently slated to become commander of one corps upon creation of the 8th Army. His 41st Division had performed well at Hollandia, but it was said that Major General Fuller had his doubts about the Byack operation, with the doubts seemingly vindicated by the difficulty the troops encountered from 28 May 1944 onwards. The reconnaissance at Byack was inadequate, but he was also under pressure to seize the airfields as quickly as possible. There was, in the land campaign, a path being sought to the Philippines by the autumn of 1944. Much later, one of the then airborne colonels in the same corps, who later became a lieutenant general in the 1950s, Joseph Swing, commented that, quote, Horace Fuller was a great friend of mine. He just didn't have it, if you know what I mean. It is hard to teach people how to be leaders. You got it or you haven't got it. End quote. That is an extraordinary statement, particularly by one officer about another. There are others who said that Major General Fuller was too old for a division command. After being relieved at his own request from command of the division, in November 1944, Major General Fuller became the Deputy Chief of Staff at the Southeast Asian Command, retiring from the Army in August 1960. He died in 1966 at the age of 80. Harold Riegelman, a graduate of the Columbia Law School, New York, a prominent New York lawyer, became, after the war, the Postmaster General of New York on appointment by President Eisenhower, which role he relinquished to run unsuccessfully for Mayor of New York as a Republican in 1953. Princess Alexandra stayed in the same room at the same house as Major General Fuller at Clancholla House, with the McDonalds in residence during Princess Alexandra's tour of Queensland in 1959. The 41st Infantry Division became, in 1965, the 41st Infantry Brigade, seeing combat in the Iraq War in 2003 and 2008, and then in Afghanistan in 2014. In conclusion, there is no indication of what Major General Horace Fuller did in the last 20 or so years of his life, from 1946 to 1966, after leaving the Army. His time in Queensland was relatively short, some 3 to 4 months in 1942. But in the context of all that was going on, it was so very important, logistically, in terms of morale, and maybe it was, to use Winston Churchill's phrase, the end of the beginning.